Here is a series of some short popular NES games and their world records since December 2019. Most of these games haven't had all too much of an improvement. After all, these games have been out for well over 30 years, their strategies are very established, and while people are definitely still very interested in these games and actively run them, running one of these games often feels like the solution is mostly figured out. The runs are typically considered well optimized. Don't get me wrong, new strats come around every now and then for just about all of the games you're seeing on your screen right now, but we're usually talking about minor improvements to specific spots of the run, not a complete overhaul or anything of the kind. As you can see, this is a very common trend among this type of games. Here's Castlevania. Castlevania saw what could only be described as a complete revolution to its speedrun. Here's what happened. For the longest time, Castlevania was very similar to all those other runs. It was a short run, with some cool tricks here and there, but otherwise going through the game fairly normally, and most importantly, the world record was getting pretty optimized. In December of 2019, the world record was standing at an 1124. In March of 2021, that record went down to an 1119 after several exchanges between Tuznek, Evade Captcha, Kamek, and myself. Each new record that was getting set in this period was very small. The biggest record was by 52 frames, or a little under a second. It was getting to the point where we were resetting over extremely small things, and there weren't many sensible strategies left to be implemented. But things were going to change pretty soon. Let's go back in time a bit. Out of nowhere, on August 15th, 2020, Infomaniac posted a pretty weird discovery that they just made on the Castlevania speedrunning Discord. They were messing around with using turbo on the D-pad, and they noticed that sometimes this would cause the entire level of screen to just load incorrectly. Tasser Scrimpe immediately began investigating this glitch, and it was determined that the cause was a flaw in the game's algorithm used to load tiles off screen. Basically, when someone is walking in a direction, the game gradually unloads collision behind him and starts loading it in front of him. The problem is that, to optimize for performance, these collision updates only run if someone is currently moving, and, more notably, only every 2 frames. This means that by only moving every other frame, it is possible to never let the game update tiles, and so you're left with whatever garbage was previously loaded in memory. This was pretty huge, because being able to manipulate the level layout led to many shortcuts, but there was one big problem with it. Permanently unloading an entire tile was thought to require holding the D-pad for only 1 frame, on exactly the frame the game was not updating collision, for roughly 30 times in a row. This essentially meant winning about 30 coin flips in a row, so it was definitely unviable for RTA attempts. But still, this was a great strategy for TASes, and it came to be called the scroll glitch. And so, a new 80% TAS was later published that improved the previous time by over 56 seconds thanks to it. RTA runners kept essentially ignoring this glitch, and again, in March of 2021, the world record was standing at an 1119. Now, the big thing happened on April 16th, 2021. A runner by the name of Nagos Fast was attempting to get a sub 12. On one particular run, he missed a Fleaman and had to turn around a couple times to try and kill it. And then, this happened.
Damn it. Wait a second.
I think an interesting observation to be made here is that had Infomaniac never found the scroll glitch in the first place, this glitch would have probably gotten ignored by the speedrunning community and just relegated as a weird hardware bug or something like that. We've seen examples of that kind of stuff a few times already, they're really not too rare. But now, it was pretty obvious what probably had happened, even though the way this was achieved did not match the way this trick was understood to be working. A couple weeks later, I decided I would try to simply replicate Nagos Fast's play frame by frame in a TAS environment, and to my surprise, that was enough to immediately replicate the glitch. I showed the glitch to Tasser's Challenger and Scrimpe, and we were able to make this work a little bit faster by simply turning around twice for a single frame. Scrimpe then quickly figured out the reason this worked, and it was essentially another separate exploit of the tile loading algorithm. Basically, the game splits columns into 6 chunks and loads them sequentially one by one. Again, this loading only happens every 2 frames and only if someone is currently moving. The problem with this algorithm is that if someone moves backwards instead of forwards, the game will now load the tile in the other direction, but it will still assume the loading completed successfully and it will happily move on to loading the next chunk in the column. This way, a chunk can be manipulated into not being loaded correctly. Now, the loading algorithm actually does multiple passes on a column, so it is necessary to do more than one turnaround in a precise spot, and is also the reason why this is so hard to get on accident. But once someone has advanced far enough, then the game will just move on to the next column, and the glitch tile will be locked in, making the manipulation complete. The real Bong quickly became the first person to pull this off intentionally. It took him several minutes of trying, but eventually got it once. Now this was finally doable for RTA, but it's still incredibly difficult to press two buttons for exactly one frame within a frame-perfect window. Worst of all, since these turnarounds have to be done exactly when a tile is being loaded, if there's any variance in the room leading up to it, then the frame that you have to turn around on literally changes, so for human play, there will essentially be luck involved in this as well. So I got to work for a few days, and eventually came up with a setup that made this whole thing a lot more consistent. The first problem was that the frame you have to turn around on changes depending on the value of the room's frame counter. Basically, you have to turn around on an odd frame for the scroll glitch to work. One way to get around this is to simply turn around by 2 frames instead of 1. By doing so, regardless of the alignment with the frame counter, if there are 2 consecutive frames of backward movement, there is always going to be one odd frame and one even frame, resulting in the game updating tiles at least once and exactly once. The issue with this is that it's still very difficult to hold the D-pad for exactly 2 frames. This is, interestingly enough, made extra difficult by the fact that Castlevania doesn't actually poll for inputs at a consistent rate. There is up to roughly 2 milliseconds of variance in the exact moment in time inputs are read from the controller. But luckily enough, there is one way to make this input a little bit easier. By doing a whip buffer. By inputting the D-pad backwards and pressing B exactly 1 frame later, Salmon will always move backward by 2 frames. This is still difficult to do reliably, but it's a little bit easier than just holding the D-pad for 2 frames. To top off the setup, I also came up with the idea to line up Salmon with a specific pixel outside of the column's loading range and then jumping into it. What this was an easy way to stop on the right pixel to start the trick on while also moving at a consistent rate, because moving in a staggered way would throw the loading mechanism off. Luckily, there's always one good pixel where you can stop and do the first turnaround, regardless of whether you're stopping on an odd or even frame, meaning that's not a concern here. Now, this requires pressing jump and forward on the same frame. This is possible to fail as well, so I came up with another small adjustment to make this easier. I would position Salmon 1 pixel to the left of the ideal pixel while facing away, and then trying this jump. If Salmon doesn't turn around during the jump, that means the jump input and the D-pad were pressed on the same frame, and I can now hold the D-pad forward as well as down to buffer a movement by a single pixel upon landing. I could then uncrouch and have Salmon be on the correct pixel. If instead Salmon turned around, then that means that the D-pad was probably pressed 1 frame before the jump, and I could just skip the buffered crouch movement to land on the correct pixel right away. And as you might know, in this game if you press the jump button before the D-pad, you just get a neutral jump and it's impossible to maneuver Salmon in midair, so you can just land and try the jump again. With a setup on hand, let's now take a look at the first spot that this was applied to. In this stage, if you manage to unload these blocks over here, you can go back to the start of the room, which has the special property of locking the camera until you walk to the top floor. If once you're back here, you now touch the left side of the screen, it tricks the game into believing the stage has just been completed and brings Salmon to the next stage through a door from nowhere. So here's what the trick looks like. First, Salmon has to get far enough into the room to unload the column we want to manipulate. Next, we position Salmon on the correct pixel and jump in. Once we land on the target pixel, we do the first turnaround by pressing the D-pad backwards and then the whip button 1 frame later. This moves Salmon backwards by 2 frames. Now comes arguably the most difficult part. We need to move forward by exactly 14 frames. We need to stop right before the game would do the second pass on the block, and unfortunately there isn't a movement option that can easily do this for us, so we just need to hold the D-pad forward for 14 frames. Once that's done, we do one final turnaround with the help of a whip buffer, and then walk forward. The manipulation is complete and we can go through this door. This is a pretty complex setup, but it definitely made things a little easier. One good thing about it too was that if anything was off by 1 frame, like for example walking forward for 13 frames instead of 14, there was still a chance the trick worked, depending on how the movement aligned with the room's frame counter. After all that matters is that 7 frames of movement are executed while the game is attempting to load tiles, so if those 13 frames of movement are started on an odd frame counter, there will still be 7 frames where the game updates tiles, and it's all good. It's just not guaranteed at that point. After getting a few small new records with this trick, I then started experimenting with implementing another scroll glitch, this time on this screen. If this block is not present and someone climbs this staircase, then there won't be anything to get someone off the climbing stair state and you can just go to the next screen immediately. This one saved a little bit more, around 9 seconds, but it was made harder by the fact that the target block was high up on the screen. Since the game loads tile sets in a column from top to bottom, it actually means the blocks on the top get touched first from a pass on a column, and this block is high enough to where the game has time to do a third pass on it with this setup. This means 3 turnarounds are required for this manipulation, which made it a little bit harder. I was eventually able to get both of these scroll glitches in the same run, which clocked in at an 11:05. This was an 11-second improvement over the previous record, and it was the biggest time jump that Castlevania's world record had seen since at least 2011 with Funtok's 12:06. After that, I started experimenting with more ideas to save time. After all, the sub 11 was starting to look pretty realistic. There were a lot more spots that in theory had available shortcuts through the scroll glitch. First, by not loading 2 tile sets at the top of this staircase, it is possible to bring someone up into the next screen much earlier, like with stage 13. The reason 2 blocks are necessary in this case is because the tile set on the left actually has a solid small tile at the top that would get someone off stairs. A big problem with this one though is that the glitch would need to be performed under the crushers, and by taking it slow you just need to crouch under the middle crusher several times and the trick didn't end up saving any time. It was also possible to do another scroll glitch on the previous screen, which skipped a little bit more of the level. The problem with this one though is that it is necessary to manipulate 2 tile sets right next to each other in the same column. The immediate solution would seem to be to do a 4-frame turnaround, but there's a problem with that. Since the first block is so close to the top of the screen, doing a 4-frame turnaround would actually step outside of the column's loading range and it would reset the entire pass on the column. A 3-frame turnaround would work, but only 50% of the time. So coupled with the problem of, well, having to do it while surrounded by Medusa heads, this one was deemed too difficult. Next, there was a scroll glitch in stage 17. This one also required removing 2 tile sets, and the spot where it needed to be performed was around Harpies, so this one was pretty much off the table for the moment. The final scroll glitch to be theory crafted for RTA was another one in stage 14. You could create a hole in the ceiling here, so that after you went through the door from nowhere, you could use the skeleton at the top to damage boost up early. This one was the closest to being viable, but it only saved a few seconds, so I ended up feeling like this wasn't worth it either. The test did a lot more scroll glitches than these ones, but all of them just didn't save much time at all, and having to use the slower setup with whip buffers meant none of them were worth attempting. Thus, the only other possible avenue was simply to try and speed up the scroll glitch setup itself. What I ended up attempting was to remove the whip buffers and just actually trying to hold the D-pad for 2 frames. I tried simply doing it in one smooth motion without ever pausing, but I thought this was too difficult at the time, so I was still doing all the movements individually and pausing in between each input. And so, I did attempts for a few weeks, just trying the 2 original scroll glitches with the faster inputs, but I never managed to close out a new world record in that time. And since I had already been running pretty much exclusively Castlevania for the past 4 months, I was getting a little bit burnt out and ended up taking a break. Things stayed a little stagnant for a while. While people were certainly still experimenting here and there, and a few people were getting PBs with the scroll glitch, this trick just wasn't attempted by most people at the time because they didn't think it was worth it with how difficult it was. Furthermore, other top runners just didn't feel like grinding for the world record with this trick, so that 11:05 time just kinda stood unbeaten for a while. Then, in late 2021, JC picked up the game again. JC had run the game before in 2018, setting the first time under 11:30 and notably getting the first record with the 2-cycle Dracula, which was a really difficult frame perfect and RNG reliant strat at the time. JC runs several games and always has a pretty intense approach to them. Castlevania wasn't an exception to him either. Very early on, he decided he would commit to trying to do the scroll glitch the faster way that I and everyone else had tried to avoid so far. All in one motion, no pauses. This took him a while to get good at, but eventually started seeing pretty decent consistency at it. What it essentially ended up developing into was a sort of rhythm. He would essentially start focusing mainly on the turn back part of the trick, so basically you could just hold forward and press backwards on the D-pad within a rhythm. Sure, you still needed to make sure the backward presses were as close as possible to 2 frames in length, and the possibility of having neutral frames around the turnbacks could mess up the rhythm. But there was still that little bit of leniency that the old setup had if you got lucky enough, and it being a rhythm made it a little easier to actually time the backward presses. The scroll glitch method also meant that all of these scroll glitches that were previously too hard to attempt due to hazards surrounding it were now viable. JC started implementing 3 of these scroll glitches that had been theory crafted thus far. The one in the Crusher's room, the additional one in stage 14, and the one in stage 17. Additionally, he also implemented yet another scroll glitch in stage 14 to get to the bottom floor slightly faster. This wasn't worth it with the old slower setup, but with JC's method it actually saved a few seconds if successful and didn't lose much time if failed, so there was some pretty good value here. He was now essentially attempting to get 6 scroll glitches in the same run. When taking into account that 2 of these are made up of 2 tile sets, that actually brings the total number of individual scroll glitches up to 8, which is pretty insane. By the way, the speedrunning community thought it would be a funny idea to start giving these scroll glitches some ridiculous names, which I will now list off. This one is simply called Crusher Glitch, somehow. This one is referred to as firing up the griddle. These 3 in stage 14 are called the bacon, egg, and cheese, and this one in stage 17 doesn't actually have a consensus as to what it should be called. I like calling it the tiramisu, but recently some people have been calling it the biscuit. On top of that, this overall scroll glitch method came to be known as wiggling.
Wiggly woo.
On April 9th, 2022, JC closed out at 10:45, which is the current world record. This run got all of these scroll glitches except for the one in stage 17. He actually got a tile pattern that would have allowed him to damage boost up, which after being forced into a 3-cycle Dracula fight due to less health would have still saved a little bit of time. But in the heat of the moment, he opted out of it for safety. Despite this 10:45 is mostly pretty clean and very difficult to beat, despite what JC will tell you about his level 3 being garbage. Anyone attempting to do so essentially has to get at least 5 of these scroll glitches while also using the wiggling method. We're working on it. For the most part, JC's wiggles became standard. Several other people started picking them up, and it's pretty much the current meta at high level play. That being said, there has been one major development on it, the 412 method. This was an idea by Triss to make the scroll glitch slightly easier. Instead of going forward by 14 frames and backward by 2, you could go forward by 12 and backward by 4. This lost a bit of time throughout the course of the run, but it added more leniency to the trick, since moving backward by 4 frames means you're moving 2 tile sets at once, so if a mistake happens, you might end up loading the block you don't actually care about. Basically, it increases the likelihood of not losing the glitch if a mistake gets made. This method was being developed during the course of JC's grind, so he had started implementing it on left-facing scroll glitches, but not right-facing ones. These feel a little different from left-facing ones, and would have required him to relearn some new muscle memory, which to him didn't feel worth it due to the extra time loss he would have had to take with it. Now, as far as the future for the scroll glitch goes, there are actually a few additional scroll glitches that have been theory crafted that might eventually make their way into the run. First up, the Stage of 5 scroll glitch. A setup involving whip buffers was eventually developed that makes the room's frame counter consistent, making the trick work 100% of the time with a 3-frame turnaround. Once you damage boost up, you are free to wiggle around a few times and get the glitch. Doing this trick means you don't have to do the crusher glitch anymore, since that section is completely skipped over. One problem with it though is that you can't grab the holy water anymore, which is right next to this crusher, so you have to fight Medusa with the stopwatch, which is a much slower and even much harder fight if you're going for a crit to speed it up. On top of that, this trick overall only saves roughly 2 seconds, and since it's also considerably harder than the crusher glitch, its value is pretty low at the moment. And, of course, the name that this trick has been given is the Pineapple Express. Don't ask. Next, there's a scroll glitch that is arguably already viable in Stage of 7. This one requires 2 tile sets to be moved, and one of the turnarounds comes pretty close to being hit by a fleaman. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. This would be an additional scroll glitch to be brought into the run on top of everything else, and would save roughly 1.5 seconds. Overall, this one isn't excessively difficult, but again, its value is pretty low at the moment. Despite that, Trisk notably likes to throw this glitch in his attempts here and there. He's gone back and forth between only going for it on bad paces to going for it on all runs, but the bottom line is, there's a solid chance this one could make its way into a new record. There's also another scroll glitch in stage 13 that could be done to speed up the start of stage 14 a little. This one requires juggling a tile set across the screen twice, and saves even less than the one in stage of 7. With the 412 method, it's less than a second. Finally, it is possible to scroll glitch on 3 boss fights: Medusa, Frink, and Death. You can create a 2-tile space under which if someone gets a crit, these bosses die in 1 hit. This can save a few seconds, but on top of adding a scroll glitch, it also adds a frame perfect crit to the run, so the difficulty for this is pretty high for still not much of a time save. For the record, while both Medusa and Frink already have crits that top runners go for on a regular basis, through some dark magic, they both have setups that make the crits a wider frame window, so they're not that hard to begin with. On the other hand, doing the crit on the 2-tile height would generally be frame perfect, although there's theoretically an inconsistent setup for Medusa that can make it a bigger frame window once again. Unfortunately, this setup only works about half the times due to randomness in Medusa's movement. There's many more scroll glitches that exist in theory, but none of them have ever been considered seriously so far. The scroll glitch iceberg runs pretty deep. And that's it! This turned into a much longer video than I was anticipating, but there really was a lot more to talk about than I originally thought. I think this game is a great example of how a speedrun of a game rarely ever actually quote-unquote dies. If you hang around in speedrunning circles, it's very common when a new world record gets set that is really good for people to exclaim that it's the end of the line for that game, that it's dead. I must have heard this about Castlevania for maybe about 4 or 5 different records. But each and every time, all that ended up happening so far is that someone pushes the run even farther and it gets even crazier and harder. Even now, with the run at the hardest it's ever been by far, when JC's time ends up getting beaten, I think we're still far from the end of Castlevania 80%. So long as people still continue caring about the game, Dracula's castle shall rise up once again, and we will see it crumble faster and faster for at least a very long time. That being said, run an E% no scroll glitch instead if you value your sanity, please.